The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the forest floor into a sucking quagmire of mud and rotting leaves. Elias, the group's reluctant leader, wiped sweat from his brow despite the chill, his eyes scanning the dense thicket ahead. It was then that they saw it. A cabin not merely abandoned, but seemingly rejected by time itself. The wood was blackened, not by fire, but by a strange, oily mold that pulsed faintly in the twilight. Inside, the air smelled of copper and old blood. On a dusty table lay a leather-bound journal, its pages brittle and stained with dark, rusty spots. Sarah, the most curious among them, reached out, her fingers trembling as she traced the embossed symbols on the cover. "Don't touch it," Mark warned, his voice barely a whisper, but the allure was too strong. As Sarah opened the book, a cold wind slammed the door shut, plunging them into darkness. The only light came from the moon filtering through cracked windows, illuminating the first page. The text wasn't written in ink. It looked like dried scabs scratched into the parchment. Elias felt a sudden, sharp pain in his gums, tasting iron, as if the forest itself was bleeding into his mouth. They were no longer just hikers. They had become participants in a ritual they didn't understand, standing on the threshold of a nightmare that had been waiting centuries for fresh meat. Sarah's eyes glazed over, reflecting a hypnotic green light that seemed to emanate from the pages themselves. She began to read aloud, her voice changing pitch, becoming deeper, guttural, and unnatural. The words were jagged, tearing at their throats as they tried to speak them, yet she flowed through them with terrifying ease. "Sanguis Silvae, corpus meum," she chanted, the Latin phrases twisting into something older, something primal. Elias tried to grab the book, but his hands slipped on the slick, wet pages as if they were coated in fresh gore. Suddenly, the candle flames turned blue and elongated, stretching toward the ceiling like desperate fingers. A low hum vibrated through the floorboards, shaking their bones. Mark screamed as a splinter from the table drove itself into his palm, not by accident, but with malicious intent, pinning his hand to the wood. Blood welled up, dark and thick, dripping onto the journal. The book absorbed it instantly, the pages swelling and pulsing like a living heart. The incantation wasn't a sealing spell. It was an invitation. The shadows in the corners of the room detached themselves from the walls, coalescing into humanoid shapes with hollow, empty sockets where eyes should be. The air grew heavy, pressing against their chests, making every breath a struggle against invisible weights. They realized too late that they hadn't found a shelter. They had walked into a stomach. They burst out of the cabin, gasping for air, only to find the world outside had fundamentally changed. The trees, once tall and straight pines, now twisted into agonizing spirals, their bark resembling stretched human skin, pale and translucent. Veins pulsed beneath the surface of the trunks, pumping a black ichor that smelled of sulfur and decay. The trail they had come in on was gone. In its place was a labyrinth of roots that shifted and writhed like snakes whenever they looked away. Elias checked his compass, but the needle spun violently, cracking the glass face before snapping off. "We need to stick together," he shouted, but his voice sounded distant, muffled by the thick, oppressive fog that rolled in from nowhere. The fog wasn't white. It was a sickly yellow, clinging to their skin like sticky spiderwebs. Jenny, the youngest, screamed as a branch whipped out from the darkness, slicing across her cheek. The cut didn't bleed red. It oozed a clear, viscous fluid that burned like acid. She clawed at her face, her nails digging into her own flesh in panic. The forest was alive and it was hungry. Every step they took sank deeper into the mud, which felt warm and soft, like decomposing tissue. The sounds of the night, crickets, owls, were replaced by a deafening silence, broken only by the wet, squelching sound of the ground breathing beneath their feet. As they stumbled through the twisted labyrinth, a voice called out from the darkness. "Help me, please, it hurts." It was Jenny's voice, clear and terrified. But Jenny was standing right next to Elias, her mouth taped shut by vines that had grown rapidly from the ground. Her eyes were wide with horror, tears streaming down her face as she shook her head violently. "That's not me!" She tried to scream, but the vines tightened, cutting into her lips. Another voice joined the chorus. This time it was Mark's. "Over here. I found a way out." Mark was 10 feet away, paralyzed by fear, watching his own voice betray him. The entities in the woods were learning. They weren't just ghosts. They were predators using sound as bait. The voices grew louder, more desperate, overlapping in a cacophony of pleas. Then, the tone shifted. The pleading stopped, replaced by a low, mocking laughter that echoed from every direction. "You taste so sweet," the voice whispered, now sounding exactly like Elias's deceased mother. He froze, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The psychological torture was worse than the physical pain. The forest knew their deepest fears, their deepest loves, and it used them as weapons. Shadows lengthened, detaching from the trees to form figures that looked like their loved ones, but with faces melted like wax, smiling with too many teeth. Mark was the first to break. The constant mimicry of his voice, combined with the sight of his own doppelganger stepping out from behind a tree, shattered his sanity. The figure looked exactly like him, except its skin was peeled back, revealing raw muscle and bone underneath. It smiled, exposing a jaw unhinged like a snake's. "Come home, Mark," it gurgled, blood frothing at its lips. Mark screamed, a raw, primal sound, and ran toward the figure, drawn by a supernatural compulsion he couldn't resist. Elias lunged to stop him, but roots erupted from the ground, wrapping around Mark's ankles and dragging him backward. "No! Help me!" Mark cried, his fingers clawing at the dirt, leaving deep furrows. But the forest was faster. The roots pulled him into the earth, not burying him, but absorbing him. His screams were cut short as the soil closed over his head. For a moment there was silence. Then, the ground bulged, and a new tree sprouted rapidly, its bark forming a grotesque, screaming face that mirrored Mark's final expression. Fresh blood seeped from the knots in the wood, pooling around Elias's boots. The tree's branches reached out, snapping like whips, trying to grab Sarah and Jenny. They weren't just watching. They were being harvested. Panic turned into a frenzy. Sarah and Jenny ran blindly, their lungs burning from the toxic air. The forest seemed to shrink around them, the trees closing in like the bars of a cage. Branches slashed at their clothes and skin, leaving shallow cuts that stung with venom. Jenny tripped, falling hard onto a bed of thorns. Before she could rise, the thorns pierced her legs, anchoring her to the spot. "Leave me," she sobbed, seeing the shadowy figures closing in. Sarah hesitated, torn between survival and loyalty, but the forest gave her no choice. A vine lashed out, wrapping around Sarah's waist and yanking her upward. She dangled 20 feet in the air, choking as the vine tightened. Below, Jenny watched in horror as the shadows converged on her. They didn't attack immediately. They circled, sniffing her fear. One figure, resembling a distorted version of Sarah, leaned down and whispered, "She's already dead." Then the shadows descended. Jenny's screams were brief, ending in a wet crunch as the entities tore into her flesh, not to eat, but to integrate. Her body dissolved into the mulch, becoming part of the forest's nutrient cycle. Sarah, hanging above, watched her friend vanish into the earth, her own blood dripping down to feed the roots that held her captive. The forest was feeding and it was enjoying the meal. Sarah was alone. The vine lowered her gently to the ground, not to release her, but to present her to the master of the woods. From the shadows emerged a figure made entirely of tangled roots, bones, and moss. It had no face, only a void that sucked in the light. It didn't speak. It projected thoughts directly into her mind, cold and ancient. "You are the vessel," it thought. Sarah tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. Her skin began to itch, then burn. She looked down to see green shoots emerging from her pores, roots drilling into her muscles. She wasn't dying. She was transforming. Her screams turned into the rustling of leaves. Her eyes hardened into amber resin. She realized with horrifying clarity that she would never leave. She would become part of the Whispering Pines, her consciousness trapped in the wood, forced to mimic the voices of future victims to lure them in. Years later, another group of hikers would find a journal, and a young woman would read the incantation. And deep in the woods, a new pine tree would shiver, its branches reaching out like grasping hands, waiting to welcome them home. The cycle continued, fueled by blood and sorrow, eternal and unbreakable. Arthur adjusted his GPS unit, the screen flickering in the damp twilight of the Blackwood Reserve. He had marked 3 ancient oaks yesterday with bright orange spray paint, standard procedure for documenting illegal logging boundaries. But today, the trees were gone. Not cut down. There were no stumps, no sawdust, no tire tracks. They had simply vanished, leaving behind smooth, undisturbed earth that looked as if it had never been touched. A cold sweat prickled at the back of his neck. He checked his coordinates again. He was in the exact right spot. Kneeling down, he dug his fingers into the soil. It felt wrong. Too warm, too soft, pulsing slightly beneath his fingertips like a sleeping animal's flank. As he pulled his hand back, he noticed thin, white filaments clinging to his skin. They weren't roots. They looked like nerve endings, twitching and seeking purchase. He wiped them off, disgusted, but a faint tingling remained in his pores. The forest around him was unnaturally silent. No birds, no insects. Just the heavy, oppressive weight of watching eyes hidden within the dense canopy. Arthur felt a sudden, irrational urge to leave, but his legs felt heavy, anchored by an invisible force. The air smelled of ozone and burnt hair, a scent that triggered a primal fear deep in his gut. He wasn't just losing data, he was losing his grasp on reality. The map on his tablet glitched, the green lines of the forest rearranging themselves into a shape that resembled a screaming face. Seeking answers, Arthur drove to the local archives, a dusty basement beneath the town library. The librarian, an elderly woman with cataracts that made her eyes look like cloudy marbles, handed him a brittle newspaper from 1954 without a word. The headline screamed, "Forest fire claims 20 loggers." The article detailed a catastrophic blaze that had consumed a crew of illegal loggers who had ignored safety warnings. They hadn't died from the flames alone. The report mentioned strange findings. Bodies fused with the charcoal remains of the trees they had been cutting. Their bones had merged with the wood, their screams silenced by the ash. Arthur read on, his heart pounding. The survivors claimed the forest had taken them back. He found a photograph attached to the file, a black and white image of the burned site. In the background, among the charred trunks, stood figures that looked disturbingly human, their limbs elongated and twisted into branch-like shapes. One figure seemed to be looking directly at the camera, its mouth open in a silent agony. As Arthur stared at the photo, the paper began to crumble in his hands, turning into gray ash that stained his fingers. He tried to drop it, but the ash stuck to his skin, burning like dry ice. The librarian whispered, "They don't like being remembered, Mr. Arthur. They prefer being part of the whole." The lights in the archive flickered and died, leaving him in darkness, the smell of smoke filling his lungs. Returning to his cabin near the reserve edge, Arthur felt a persistent itch on his left forearm. He scratched it vigorously, expecting a bug bite, but his nails caught on something hard. Under the harsh bathroom light, he gasped. Patches of his skin had turned gray and rough, resembling tree bark. It wasn't a rash. It was a transformation. The texture was woody, fibrous, and cold to the touch. He tried to peel it off, panic rising in his throat, but the bark was deeply rooted in his flesh. Pulling at it caused sharp, tearing pain, and blood seeped out. Not red, but a thick, dark sap that smelled of pine resin. He wrapped his arm in bandages, trying to rationalize it as an allergic reaction to the plants. But he knew better. That night, he couldn't sleep. The silence of the woods outside was broken by a low, rhythmic thumping, like a giant heart beating underground. Asterisk thump thump, thump thump. It synchronized with his own heartbeat, then slowly began to override it. He lay in bed, sweating profusely, feeling his veins harden. When he looked at his legs, he saw blue veins bulging, not with blood, but with something green and viscous moving beneath the skin. He screamed, but the sound was muffled, as if his throat was filling with moss. The boundary between his body and the environment was dissolving. By morning, Arthur could barely walk. His joints had stiffened, locking into place with audible clicks. He dragged himself to the window, needing to see the source of the noise. The forest was breathing. Literally, the trees expanded and contracted in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, their bark splitting open to reveal raw, pink flesh underneath. The leaves didn't rustle in the wind. They quivered like skin reacting to a cold touch. Arthur pressed his hand against the glass, and to his horror, the window pane fogged up from the inside with condensation that smelled of earth. He realized the air in the cabin was changing, becoming thick with spores. He coughed, expelling a cloud of green dust. Looking in the mirror, he saw his eyes changing. The whites were yellowing, and the pupils had elongated into vertical slits, like those of a reptile or a cat. But worse, tiny rootlets were emerging from his tear ducts, weaving across his cheeks. He tried to pull them out, but they were connected to his optic nerves. Every tug sent blinding flashes of light and images of the forest's history into his brain. Centuries of growth, decay, and death. He wasn't just seeing the forest. He was remembering it. The pain was excruciating, a white-hot fire spreading through his nervous system, rewriting his DNA strand by strand. Driven by an instinct he no longer controlled, Arthur stumbled out of the cabin. The ground felt inviting, soft and warm. He fell to his knees, not in prayer, but in submission. The soil parted before him, revealing a network of glowing white roots that pulsed with bioluminescent light. They reached for him, gentle yet irresistible. He wanted to run, but his legs had fused together, the skin merging into a single woody trunk. He watched in detached horror as his toes lengthened, digging deep into the earth, seeking water and nutrients. The pain had faded, replaced by a euphoric sense of connection. He could feel the moisture in the soil miles away. He could sense the worms tunneling through the dirt. A voice echoed in his mind, not spoken, but felt. A chorus of thousands of voices, the loggers from the fire. "Join us," they whispered. "We are safe here. We are eternal." Arthur tried to scream no, but his mouth had sealed shut, his lips merging into the bark of his forming torso. His arms stretched upward, fingers splitting into twigs and leaves. He was no longer Arthur the researcher. He was becoming part of the ecosystem, a guardian bound by flesh and wood. The transformation was complete, and it was beautiful in its terror. Consciousness returned, but it was different. Arthur was no longer a single entity. He was a node in a vast sentient network. He could feel the presence of other guardians, twisted, humanoid shapes hidden among the trees, their faces frozen in eternal screams, their bodies fused with oak and pine. They were the loggers from 1954 and countless others before them. They didn't hate humans. They protected the forest from them. Arthur felt a surge of protective rage when he sensed a vibration in the distance. Illegal loggers, approaching with chainsaws. The sound was an abomination, a violation of the sacred silence. His new body responded instantly. Roots erupted from the ground, tripping the men. Branches whipped down, slashing tires and shattering windshields. Arthur didn't want to kill them. He wanted to assimilate them. He directed the vines to wrap around their ankles, dragging them into the soft, hungry earth. He could feel their fear, their confusion, and then their acceptance as the roots penetrated their skin. They would join the chorus. They would become part of the wall that kept the world out. The forest was growing stronger, fed by the bone and blood of intruders. Weeks later, a search party found Arthur's abandoned cabin. Inside, they found his journal, the last entry scribbled in a shaky hand. "It's not haunting, it's healing." They found no trace of Arthur. Outside, the forest seemed denser, darker. Among the trees, they noticed a new addition. A tall, slender pine with bark that strangely resembled human skin. If one looked closely, they could see the faint outline of a face in the knots, eyes closed in peaceful slumber. The rangers felt a chill, a sense of being watched by something ancient and indifferent. They marked the area as restricted and left, unaware that the roots beneath their boots were already tasting their scent, memorizing their steps. Arthur was gone, but he was everywhere. He was the wind in the branches, the creak of the wood, the silence between the bird calls. He had become the forest, and the forest was hungry for more. The cycle of root and bone continued, unseen and unstoppable, waiting for the next trespasser to step off the path and into the embrace of the earth. The horror wasn't in death. It was in the eternal, conscious integration into the wild. 7-year-old Leo sat on the floor of the new cabin, his crayons scattered like fallen leaves around him. The move to the isolated woodland had been his father's idea, a fresh start away from the city's noise. But the silence here was heavy, pressing against the windows like a physical weight. Leo wasn't drawing the mountains or the deer his parents hoped he'd see. He was drawing her, a tall, pale woman with hair like tangled roots, standing perfectly still among the pine trees. Her eyes were empty black voids, yet they seemed to follow him across the page. "Who is that, sweetie?" his mother asked, leaning over his shoulder. Her voice trembled slightly, though she tried to sound casual. Leo didn't look up. "She's waiting," he whispered, his voice flat and devoid of childhood warmth. "She says the ground is cold." His mother snatched the paper, crumpling it into a ball. "It's just your imagination, Leo. Stop drawing scary things." But as she threw it in the trash, she couldn't shake the feeling that the figure on the paper had shifted its stance, turning its head slightly toward her. That night, Leo slept with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling, listening to the scratching of branches against the roof, sounding eerily like fingernails seeking entry. Days turned into weeks, and Leo's drawings became more frequent, more detailed. Each one depicted the same pale woman, but her position changed slightly, moving closer to the cabin in each sketch. His parents, David and Elena, tried to ignore it, attributing it to adjustment anxiety. But the atmosphere in the house grew stifling. Objects moved on their own. Doors slammed without wind. One evening, while cleaning the attic, Elena found an old box labeled "Previous Owners." Inside were dusty photo albums from the 1920s. Curiosity got the better of her. She flipped through the pages, smiling at the vintage fashion, until she froze. In a family portrait from 1923, standing behind the smiling couple, was a faint, translucent figure. It was her. The same pale woman, the same root-like hair, the same empty eyes. Elena's hands shook as she turned to the next photo, dated 1955. Another family, another child, and there she was again, lurking in the background. By 1980, the figure was clearer, almost solid. And in every single photo, a young boy stood in the foreground, looking terrified. The pattern was undeniable. This wasn't a ghost haunting a place. It was a ghost hunting a lineage. She dropped the album, the dust motes dancing in the light like mocking spirits. David refused to believe in ghosts, blaming stress and old photography tricks. But when Leo started sleepwalking, pointing toward the dense thicket behind the house, David decided to investigate. He took a shovel and a flashlight, venturing into the woods at dusk. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Following Leo's earlier sketches, which he had secretly kept, David found a spot where the trees formed a perfect circle. The ground here was different, soft, spongy, and devoid of vegetation. As he dug, the shovel hit something hard. Not rock, but wood. Rotting wood. He cleared the dirt to reveal not one, but dozens of small, crude wooden markers, barely visible above the soil. They weren't headstones. They were toys. Wooden soldiers, dolls, and carved animals, all blackened by age. Beneath them lay shallow graves, too small for adults. Children's graves. Unmarked, unrecorded, forgotten. A chill ran down David's spine as he realized the truth. This wasn't just a burial ground. It was a collection. The woman wasn't mourning them. She was keeping them. And now she wanted Leo. The flashlight flickered and died, leaving him in total darkness, surrounded by the silent testimony of lost children. Leo woke up screaming, not from a nightmare, but from a voice inside his head. It was soft, melodic, and terrifyingly close. "Come out, little one," it whispered. "The moon is high." He sat up, his eyes glazed and unseeing. The window was open, though he remembered closing it. The curtains billowed inward, carrying the scent of wet leaves and old flowers. Leo swung his legs out of bed, his movements stiff, puppet-like. He walked out of his room, past his parents' closed door. He could hear them sleeping, their breathing rhythmic and oblivious. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, the shadows lengthening into grasping hands. At the front door, the lock clicked open on its own. Leo stepped out into the night. The forest was alive. The trees seemed to lean toward him, their branches forming an aisle leading deeper into the woods. Fireflies danced around him, but their light was cold and blue. He didn't feel fear anymore. He felt a strange, pulling longing. The voice guided him, step by step, away from the safety of the cabin, toward the hidden clearing. Almost there, the voice cooed, "She misses you." Leo smiled, a vacant, hollow expression, as he disappeared into the treeline. David and Elena woke to an empty bed and a chilling silence. Panic set in instantly. They grabbed flashlights and ran into the woods, calling Leo's name. The forest seemed to resist them. Branches whipped at their faces, and roots tripped them repeatedly. But they followed the faint trail of blue fireflies. They burst into a clearing they had never seen before. In the center stood an ancient, twisted oak tree, its bark white as bone. Underneath it stood Leo, facing away from them, and beside him stood her, the pale woman. She was taller than in the drawings, her limbs elongated and unnatural. She wore a tattered dress that seemed woven from spiderwebs and moss. Her face was smooth, featureless except for two dark pits where eyes should be. She placed a long, cold hand on Leo's shoulder. Leo didn't flinch. He looked up at her with adoration. "Mom? Dad?" Leo called out, but his voice sounded distant, echoing as if from a deep well. "I have to stay," he said. "She's lonely," Elena screamed, rushing forward, but an invisible barrier stopped her, throwing her back onto the grass. The woman turned her head slowly toward them, and a sound emerged from her. Not a voice, but the rustling of dry leaves. The cycle must continue. The woman's voice echoed in their minds, cold and ancient. "One soul for another. One child to keep me company so I may rest." Leo began to walk toward her, his feet sinking into the soft earth. Vines erupted from the ground, wrapping around his ankles, not to trap him, but to anchor him. His skin began to pale, losing its warmth, taking on the grayish hue of the woman's. "No!" David shouted, charging at the tree with his shovel. He swung it with all his might at the woman, but the blade passed through her as if she were smoke. Instead, it struck the oak tree. A shriek tore through the air, not from the woman, but from the tree itself. Black sap bled from the wound, smelling of rot. The woman laughed, a sound like cracking branches. "You cannot kill what is already dead," she whispered. Leo turned to look at his parents, tears streaming down his face, but his expression remained blank. "It doesn't hurt," he mouthed. The vines pulled him closer to the tree trunk. The bark split open, revealing a hollow space within, filled with the tiny, skeletal remains of previous children. Leo was being invited inside, to join the collection, to become part of the tree. Elena collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably, as David stood frozen, helpless. The vines pulled Leo completely into the hollow of the tree. The bark sealed shut behind him with a wet, squelching sound. Silence returned to the clearing, heavier than before. The pale woman sighed, a sound of profound relief. Her form began to fade, dissolving into mist and light. For the first time in centuries, she was free. She looked at David and Elena with something resembling pity, then vanished completely. The moonlight faded, leaving the parents in darkness. They rushed to the tree, clawing at the bark, screaming Leo's name until their voices broke. But the tree was solid, unyielding. There was no hole, no entrance, just the rough, cold wood. Weeks later, they moved away, unable to bear the silence. But sometimes, on quiet nights, hikers passing near the old cabin report seeing a new figure in the woods. A young boy, pale and still, standing among the trees. He doesn't speak. He doesn't move. He just watches, waiting for the next child to wander off the path. The cycle had reset. The clearing's child had a new guardian, and the forest was patient. It always gets what it wants. The forest didn't just smell of pine and damp earth. It smelled of ozone and burnt circuitry. Marcus, the sound engineer, adjusted his headphones, frowning as a low-frequency hum vibrated through his skull. It wasn't wind. It was a digital glitch in reality. "Check levels," he muttered into his mic. But his voice sounded distorted, layered with static that shouldn't exist in an analog recording. The documentary crew, Marcus, Sarah the director, and Jake the cameraman, had entered the Whispering Zone, a sector of the Blackwood Reserve where hikers vanished without a trace, leaving only their equipment behind. The trees here were unnaturally straight, like barcode lines against the gray sky. As they walked, the air grew thick, resisting their movement. Marcus's parabolic microphone, designed to capture distant sounds, picked up something impossible. A conversation happening 10 minutes in the future. He heard Sarah scream, then the sound of breaking bone. He ripped the headphones off, heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" he asked, pale. Sarah looked at him, confused. "Hear what?" "It's silent." But the silence was heavy, pregnant with unseen threats. The static in Marcus's ears grew louder, a whispering chorus of thousands of lost voices, all speaking at once, begging for help, or perhaps warning them to run. Jake raised his night vision camera, the green monochrome display flickering. Through the lens, the forest looked different, alive with spectral energy. Shadows detached from the trees, forming humanoid shapes that danced erratically. "Guys, look at this," Jake whispered, zooming in on a figure standing 50 yards away. It was a hiker wearing a red jacket, facing away from them. But when Jake lowered the camera to look with his naked eyes, the figure was gone. Only empty space remained. He raised the camera again. The figure was back, now closer. "It's a time echo," Marcus explained, his voice trembling. "Residual energy replaying final moments. Don't engage." But the figure in the lens turned its head. It didn't have a face, just a swirling vortex of static noise. Suddenly, the audio feed in Marcus's recorder spiked. A deafening screech tore through the speakers, causing Jake to drop the camera. The lens cracked. When they looked at the playback later, the footage showed the figure stepping out of the loop, moving toward the camera with unnatural speed. The timestamp on the video jumped forward by 3 hours. They weren't just recording history. They were inviting it into the present. The forest was no longer passive. It was watching, learning, and adapting to their technology. Night fell rapidly, swallowing the campsite in darkness. They set up perimeter alarms, motion sensors linked to bright floodlights. Marcus monitored the audio feeds, trying to filter out the background static. But the static was changing. It began to mimic their voices. "Sarah, check the battery," his own voice said from the speakers, clear and urgent. Sarah looked up, confused. "I didn't say that." Then, Jake's voice came through. "Something's behind you." Jake spun around, swinging his flashlight, but there was nothing. The entity was learning their speech patterns, their cadence, their fear. It wasn't just repeating words. It was constructing sentences to create panic. Marcus realized with horror that the entity was feeding on the recorded audio files stored in their digital recorders. Every time they saved a clip, the file size grew larger, corrupted by unknown data. The entity was using their own documentation as a blueprint to manifest physically. The floodlights flickered on, illuminating the tree line. Standing there was a figure made entirely of jagged, pixelated light, resembling their camera equipment fused with human flesh. It had lenses for eyes and microphone cables for veins. It smiled, a glitchy, tearing expression. Panic erupted. Sarah grabbed her gear, shouting orders that went unheard over the rising cacophony of static. The pixelated figure stepped forward, its movement jerky, like a video buffering. As it moved, the environment around it warped. Trees twisted into impossible angles, forming a cage of branches. Marcus noticed that the traps weren't natural. They were reconstructions of accidents reported in old news articles they had researched. A tripwire, invisible to the eye but visible on the night vision monitor, snapped tight around Jake's ankle. He screamed as his leg was yanked upward, suspended in the air. Blood poured from his shin, but instead of hitting the ground, the blood droplets froze in midair, turning into red pixels before dissolving into digital dust. The entity was rewriting the laws of physics within its radius. "Cut the feed," Marcus yelled, smashing his recorder. But it was too late. The entity had already uploaded their presence into its system. Jake's screams were looped, playing repeatedly from the trees surrounding them. The forest had become a server room, and they were the corrupted data being deleted. The coldness was absolute, freezing their breath into clouds of binary code. Marcus realized the entity was vulnerable to silence. It thrived on input, sound, image, data. "Stop recording. Turn everything off," he screamed, ripping batteries from his devices. Sarah hesitated, her instinct to document overriding her survival instinct. That hesitation cost them. The pixelated figure lunged at her, its limb extending like a telescoping lens. It struck her chest, not with force, but with information. She gasped, her eyes rolling back. Her skin began to flicker, transparency revealing skeletal structures underneath made of wire and glass. She was being digitized. Marcus grabbed her, pulling her away, but her arm remained stuck in the entity's grasp. With a sickening crunch, her arm detached, not bleeding, but sparking with electricity. The severed limb dissolved into a cloud of static, absorbed into the creature. Sarah collapsed, clutching her shoulder, her face pale and glitching. "It's inside me," she whispered, her voice overlapping with multiple other voices. "It's uploading." The forest around them began to delete itself, trees vanishing into white voids, leaving them exposed in a blank, digital wasteland. The entity was clearing the stage for the final act. Jake, still suspended by the invisible tripwire, watched in horror as Sarah deteriorated. Her body was becoming translucent, her features smoothing out into a blank, mannequin-like surface. Marcus knew he had to destroy the source. The entity was anchored to the main camera, which was still running, broadcasting their terror to nowhere or everywhere. He crawled toward the camera, the ground beneath him feeling like smooth glass. The pixelated figure blocked his path, its face a swirling storm of static. It spoke with Sarah's voice, then Jake's, then his own. "Join the archive," it commanded. Marcus closed his eyes, focusing on the silence within himself. He pulled a flare gun from his emergency kit, not to shoot the monster but to shoot the camera. The magnesium flare burned at 3,000 degrees, hot enough to melt silicon and plastic. He fired. The flare struck the camera lens, exploding in a burst of white heat. The entity shrieked, a sound of digital agony that shattered the remaining glass on their equipment. The pixelated form destabilized, fracturing into millions of tiny squares of light. Silence returned, absolute and terrifying. The forest reappeared, but it was changed. The colors were muted, gray and lifeless. Jake dropped to the ground, his leg broken but real, bleeding red blood. Sarah lay unconscious, her arm gone, but her skin was solid again, though cold to the touch. Marcus sat amidst the wreckage of their equipment, breathing heavily. They had survived, but at what cost? As they dragged themselves toward the edge of the reserve, Marcus checked his pocket recorder, which he had forgotten to destroy. He pressed play. There was no sound of the forest, no birds, no wind. Just a single, clear voice, his own whispering, "We are still here." He looked back at the trees. In the shadows, he saw faint, pixelated figures watching them, waiting. The entity hadn't been destroyed. It had been backed up. It lived in the recordings, in the memories, in the static between radio stations. They escaped the woods, but they carried the infection with them. Every time they heard static, every time a screen flickered, they would know. The clearing's child was gone, but the static woods were eternal, and they were always listening.